All right, gang, moving on to story number 2. Did you know, gang, that if you happen to be accidentally Caucasian, meaning that your family, your ancestors hailed from one of the European countries, did you know that you actually suffer from a parasitic-like condition? Well, yes, you do. And no, this claim does not come from Medium. It does not come from some, ultra left-wing blog that no one in their right mind has heard of. This comes from the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. In other words, this comes from a peer-reviewed medical journal. The article in which this claim was made was entitled On Having Whiteness, and it appears, as I said, in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, authored by Dr. Arnold Moss, an actual doctor who, gang, serves on the faculties of both the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. So in other words, this guy is not a crank. Okay, well, let me rephrase that, okay? When you claim that the color of a person's skin means that they have a parasitic-like condition, you are a crank. Some of the people in response to this story were calling it racist psychobabble at its worst. And that's absolutely 100% true. But here's the flip side to that. Because Arnold Moss is a doctor, because he is on two well-established and respected, I would say, institutions, the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis, that means that his words will automatically be accepted because he has doctor and before his name and because of where he works. So this is from Fox News, by the way, if this story comes from Fox News. So what exactly does Dr. Moss claim in his article on having whiteness? Well, Moss argues that white people possess an entitled dominion that enables the host to wield power without limit, force, without restriction, violence, without mercy, and increases one's desire to, quote-unquote, terrorize. Okay? Let me read that again. An entitled dominion that enables the host to wield power without limit, force without restriction, violence without mercy, and increases one's desire to terrorize. In other words, if you are accidentally Caucasian, if you are accidentally, just by happenstance, your family happened to come from Europe, then you suffer from a parasitic mental condition that makes you want to terrorize. Your biological makeup itself directs you to terrorize other people simply because they don't look like you. That is his claim. And he is saying this in complete seriousness. He's saying this in complete seriousness. Now, of course, this has absolutely no basis in reality, gang. This has absolutely no basis in reality because, in the first place, whiteness is such a malleable concept. I mean, what exactly, when you think about it, what exactly is right? What exactly is whiteness? You go back to the 19th century, and the Irish, they're very white. You know, up there in the north, alongside with England, they're just as white as Englishmen, but the Irish were exactly embraced with open arms here in the United States in the 19th century at points in time. Same thing with Italians. I know that I've mentioned this before, but the biggest mass lynching in American history. So, the time when the most people were lynched at the same time, like all part of the same proceedings, happened in New Orleans, 1893, I believe, and the target, they were not Black Americans, the target was not American Indians, the target was not Chinamen or Asians of any sort like that. it was Italians. The story, I believe, is that the sheriff in this Louisiana town, no, the sheriff of New Orleans, I believe, yeah. The sheriff of New Orleans, or one of the law enforcement officers, had arrested a couple of Italians, and that night, I believe, that law enforcement official was murdered. And this, of course, just sent rumors scurrying about the town that he had been killed by the mafia, by the Black Hand. And of course, all of the Italians in the area were, of course, part of this criminal conspiracy that meant to undermine law and order and religion and family and everything else. And so they gathered up, they took the guys who were in jail, plus, I think there were 2 of them, plus 9 other Italians that they had just got up, and they tortured them and killed them, lynched them. Today, the Irish are called oppressors because they're white. Today, Sicilians, Italians are called oppressors because they're white. Back just 100 years ago, though, they weren't considered white. The Irish were called mix, right? The Italians, especially Sicilians, they were called greasers, like Mexicans were. A derogatory term for Hispanics and for Sicilians. So that shows, again, that whiteness is this nebulous concept, because according to Dr. Arnold Moss here, none of that should have happened. If whiteness itself is a pathological parasitic ability that affects white people, then why were white people, terrorizing other white people? Why was that happening? And then, of course, you leave the United States. Why were the English domineering the Irish? Why, in the 14th century, with the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, why was the French royalty, the Royal House of France, why was it persecuting the Huguenots, right? Why were Spaniards fighting the Dutch in the 16th century when the Dutch tried to break free from Spain? Why were all of these things happening? Why? Why? If whiteness unites everyone who is European or of European descent, if whiteness unites all of them in this ethno-identity and focuses all of their instincts to terrorize and to wield power without limit, force without restriction, violence without mercy, outside to the other Asian, African, Hispanic, etc. Why didn't that happen? Why was history what it is instead of how it should have been according to this theory? Can't answer that because it's bunk. Okay? That's why. But even that isn't the worst part of it, because this is, in effect, the medical rationalization of what Nancy Pelosi said immediately after the January 6th riot at the Capitol, where she said the rioters had chosen their whiteness instead of democracy. And the implication in that, and I made mention of this, I think, gang, during that time, immediately after that happened, but I said, okay, the implication here is that you can either choose to be democratic or you can choose to be white. And if you choose to be white, that not only makes you a quote-unquote terrorist, but it means that you are now in contradiction to democracy. So, quote-unquote whiteness is contradictory to democracy, which also means that every, again, Caucasian person is a potential terrorist. And that's exactly what Dr. Moss says. It increases one's desire to terrorize. So if you just happen to have lighter pigmented skin, you're a terrorist. You are a born terrorist. Now, you would think that, hey, I was just born this way, so you can't get after me for that. No, sorry. Doesn't work like that anymore. Doesn't work like that here, which is, again, part of the totalitarian contradiction, which is part of the point. Yeah, if you are, quote-unquote gay, lesbian, bi, transgender, oh, well, you were just born that way. You can't change anything about that. That makes you a victim. If you were just born white, then that is totally your fault and you're a potential terrorist for doing it. The contradiction, gang, is the point. The naturalization and the denaturalization goes together. They are actually naturalizing free choices that are being made when it comes to sex, but they are denaturalizing something that absolutely no one can control, which is their genetics. Because again, they still haven't found the elusive gay gene. So there you go. Now, this is where we get even deeper. Moss continues, and he said, white people have a particular susceptibility to the parasitic condition. Effective treatment consists, okay, quote, this is from his actual, this is actually from his actual article that appeared in that peer-reviewed journal. Treatment, quote, consists of a combination of psychic and social historical interventions. Let me read that again. A combination of psychic and social historical interventions. What he is saying, he is advocating basically for re-education camps. When he says a psychic intervention, it means teaching critical race theory in the 1619 Project to kindergarteners and teaching little boys and little girls who just happen to be Caucasian that they are evil because of the color of their skin. Not just that they are inferior, they are objectively evil. And that unless they prostrate themselves before the altar of inclusion and diversity, they will actually terrorize other people who don't look like them. It also means re-education camps, literal re-education camps, because psychic intervention, okay? People who aren't in school, who are white, they're just as much of a potential terrorist as the kids. Therefore, you have to be re-educated. Therefore, that's why in the workplace, you have to have these diversity seminars. You have to be pounded with HR, with this ideology. When he says social historical interventions, he's talking about, for example, what's happening right now in California. Did you happen to know, gang, that there is a bill that is going through a California legislature at this moment, which says that the state government will pay 45% of the cost of a home for you, leaving you responsible only for 55%. The state will basically pay for half of your home, so you only have to worry about the other half. The caveat, of course, is that you have to be black, or you have to be Asian, or you have to be Hispanic, or some sort of minority. You can't be Caucasian. If you are, tough luck, pal. You have to figure that out for yourself. And so, connecting this with what I said in our first video about BlackRock and its gobbling up of homes, it means that more and more Caucasians are going to be excluded from home ownership, which is what so many families need for generational wealth and independence. So it's creating, again, the pigmentocracy. It is actually, it is sharpening the lines of the pigmentocracy. It is sharpening the lines of the pigmentocracy. And then, gang, comes the worst part of all from Moss's piece. Because you might be thinking, well, okay, so I get it. You know, white people are evil. White people have to be put down. I get it. It's not necessarily white people. This is what he says. Moss says that white people have a particular susceptibility to the parasitic condition, claiming that white pathology renders its hosts' appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. Now, listen to that carefully, gang. White people have a particular susceptibility to the parasitic condition, meaning that simply because you're white doesn't mean, simply because you're not white doesn't mean that you can't have this quote-unquote white pathology. We saw this before. We saw this before immediately after the 2020 election. There were headlines in the Washington Post, for example, which said asked in all seriousness, why Cuban Americans were being counted as Hispanic because they looked white, they didn't look brown, and because most of them vote Republican instead of Democrat. And so, of course, because of that, they were trying to wheedle themselves into the graces of white people, which meant that they had no concern and no care for anything that brown Hispanics were going through. So even if you are ethnically Hispanic now, you're not Hispanic. It's the same thing here. Remember again, immediately, pretty soon after the January 6th quote-unquote riot, the Washington Post again was talking about multiracial whiteness. Whiteness now wasn't just a skin tone, it was a specific way of acting, of thinking, even if it was nonviolent. So for example, believing in individualism, personal responsibility, punctuality, things like that, objectivity. Remember how we've said, I think I made a whole video about this, those things are now being said, they are signs of white supremacy. Well, if you happen to be black or Asian or Hispanic, and you believe in individualism, if you believe in objective truth, if you believe in punctuality, if hard work, if you believe in all of those things, then you are white. Even if you come from Nigeria, you're white. This goes back to Nicole Hannah-Jones's asinine bifurcation between racially black and politically black. This is what they're doing. Now, being white doesn't just depend on having white skin. Being black doesn't just depend on having black skin. Being Asian doesn't just depend on coming from Japan or China or Vietnam or Korea or Thailand or Taiwan or any place like that. It's how you approach the world that makes you those things. That is important. And so you only can be a minority if you actually baptize yourself in the left's ideology. That's what's happening. Now, there's something even, what this gets down to, gang, what the left is doing here, and what it's doing by medically normalizing all this jazz, is that they are setting the ground for perpetual warfare. Think about it like this. If whiteness is this great existential threat, and everyone who is white, who has this white pathology, quote unquote, whether you're actually Caucasian or not, if you are a potential terrorist, then that means that as long as the pathology exists, then that means that there are going to be potential terrorists about you, which of course justifies continually doing the things that you say are needed to defeat it. It's perpetual warfare, especially since it's never going to be defeated. Moss actually says, okay, the effective treatment consists of a combination of psychic and social historical interventions, but such interventions can reasonably aim only to reshape whiteness's infiltrated appetites, to reduce their intensity, redistribute their aims, and occasionally turn those aims towards the work of reparation. But even with said treatment, Moss warns there is no guarantee against regression, and there is not yet a permanent cure. There is not yet a permanent cure, meaning that the war against whiteness is going to have to continue, which means that the left can't just, that, for example, so critical race theory, the 1619 Project, diversity, inclusion, bills like are happening in California, that can't just be normalized. That can't just be, okay, we've reached this point and now we're going to stop. No, it has to be continually pushed further and further left, always in hope of finding this elusive cure for whiteness, and always saying that we have to go further because we might be able to find a cure, we might be able to destroy this white pathogen, which will then actually allow equality and equity and peace and justice to finally reign. It's a self-sustaining system, and it is a self-defending system, and it sets you up for perpetual warfare, like I said, which is actually what Orwell talked about in 1984. Oceania is always at war with Eurasia or East Asia. Because by always being in a war, you direct people's attentions elsewhere. And it also always justifies what you're doing and your hold of power. That's what the left here is doing. It's serious stuff, gang, and it needs to be treated as such. That is story number 2.